author, columnist, managing editor of LibertyNation.com, podcast host and conservative policy advocate.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Hello and welcome to Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio American Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. On today's special edition, we're going to be talking about the Trump-Harris debate, how that went, who are the winners and losers, and what this means for the national election coming up in November. Remember, this show is proudly sponsored by LibertyNation.com, where you can access podcasts, breaking news, analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. Welcome to Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio American Network. We're very fortunate to have with us to discuss the Trump-Harris presidential debate, possibly the only debate that they will do together. And that's Liberty Nation's senior political analyst, Mr. Tim Donner, who also happens to be the longtime host of this here radio show. Tim, thanks ever so much for being here.
Always a pleasure, Mark.
Now, let's get the first things out of the way first. Let's keep this in order. What were your overall impressions of the Kamala Harris-Donald Trump debate in Philadelphia?
Well, I think that the nation was sort of lulled into a false sense of security by the CNN debate, which was handled really very objectively by CNN, surprisingly. So I think the expectation was we were going to get the same thing in the ABC debate between Trump and Harris. And of course, we didn't. It's very hard to operate in a 3-on-1 environment. I look at it like anybody who's played basketball, played a pickup game. Let's say there's a big, tall guy on one side and 3 smaller people on the other. If they play 3-on-1 in basketball, the one guy can hit the long shot every once in a while, but he's still going to be pestered and peppered by the 3 people he has to defend. So it's really like that with the debate. There were so many opportunities for the anchors to fact check Kamala Harris on top of fact checking Donald Trump. I think what you have to do as an anchor is you have to either fact check both or fact check neither. You can't fact check one and let the other statements go unremarked upon. So, for example, when Harris talked about Project 2025, well, first of all, nobody knows what it is except it's a big, scary boogeyman. Okay, Trump has said he hasn't even read it, but the anchors didn't challenge her on that. When she said that Donald Trump said he'd be a dictator on day one, as if he said that seriously, that went unremarked upon. When he talked about Charlottesville again, which never seems to go away, even though the entire thing has been perverted into something that it wasn't. And maybe the biggest whopper of all was when she said that Donald Trump says he will terminate the Constitution. I mean, you can't get away with saying something like that if anchors are really in a position to force both candidates to clarify. So it was 3-on-1. Harris did very well, no question. She did about as well as she could, I think. I'm not sure she can exceed that performance because she managed to work within her 3-on-1 advantage very effectively. Where I differ with a lot of the analysis is that Donald Trump had a terrible night. He kept taking the bait, they say. Well, what is he supposed to do when he is accused of wanting to impose Project 2025 in the whole country? What's he supposed to do if the anchors aren't going to say, excuse me, Madam Vice President, but he's never said that. But of course they didn't. So he had to fact check her. So, excuse me, what people saw as taking the bait, I saw as Trump necessarily defending himself against these withering attacks. she was able to position herself as being moderate, respecting the military, says she won't ban fracking, when she looked like she was really digging deep to say that one, because 12 years, like Donald Trump said, 12 years she was against fracking. Now suddenly she's not. So she's flipped all these positions and wasn't held to account for it. So I will say one more thing before I stop rambling, Mark, which is that I was very curious that after the debate where the Harris team and most of the media, of course, said that she had won the debate decisively, that they were out looking for a second debate. Now, ordinarily, the candidate who lost the debate is the one who wants a second debate. And especially if you're Kamala Harris, where there was so much pressure on this first debate and she passed the test. So why would she want a second debate?
It's very,
It strikes me that that's because their internal polling shows that they're still not in the position that they need to be in to win.
I think that's a really important point. I'd like to discuss that briefly. So yeah, as soon as the event ended, the campaign team, Harris campaign team, came out saying, "Yeah, we want a second debate." Now, this strikes me as something which has actually gone largely unremarked upon. But while Kamala Harris' team was doing that, and Kamala went to an after-debate party full of supporters where she spoke briefly to supporters, Donald Trump went straight into the spin room at the debate, where it was surrogates for both his campaign and for the Harris campaign and all the media. And in the spin room there after these things, that's where people get their opinions across about this is how it happened, this is how that happened, and this is how it should be looked upon. And then the media takes that and they feed it out.
Right.
And Trump went in there, which is, I think that's never really happened before. He just
No, I don't think so.
He walks in and he says, "Oh, I think that was the best debate I've ever done." And he starts taking questions and managing the spin himself.
Yes.
And he's asked, Kamala's calling for a second debate. And he echoed these comments on Hannity, Sean Hannity on Fox later in the evening. But he said, when a prize fighter loses, the first thing they do is they ask for a rematch.
Right.
That makes me think that although obviously I'd say that most people think that Kamala won that purely because there were some very low expectations and she exceeded those expectations. She did exceed them. There were word salads or things. But she didn't land a knockout blow. And so what that means is that she's now got to compete with Donald Trump in the media. And we'll talk about the media a lot later, but she has to compete on a field where she's going to have to do interviews. She's going to have to take impromptu questions, which she has not done yet. But if she can get into a debate format, then maybe she can strike gold twice. And she might be able to put off all of that campaigning that Donald Trump's out there doing. I think that might be why she asked for a second debate. But you're absolutely right. It's usually the defeated one that asks for a second debate because they need a second chance. And that probably does tell us quite a bit about the mindset of the Harris campaign in the wake of the debate. And we're going to discuss that as soon as we get back after this short break.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back on Liberty Nation Radio with longtime host of this here show, Tim Donner. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. So, Tim, let's talk about the mindset of the Harris campaign in the wake of the presidential debate. We've just been discussing that it's usually only the defeated person that asks for a second debate or demands a second debate even because they want another bite at the apple to prove that this disaster was just a one-off and they can do much better.
Right.
So where do you think her campaign goes from here with regards to the media? Because she still hasn't opened up. She still hasn't done impromptu questions. What's the strategy?
Well, I would think that her confidence level must be much higher after this first debate. her campaign has said that she will be out there doing more interviews. Now, whether that means a press conference, not likely, but she will likely continue to be hitting new media, hitting podcasts, X, formerly Twitter. She's going to try to, I think, hit target audiences that are captive, that are different than having big rallies like Trump has. Now, Trump is on social media actively as well, but I think the Harris campaign now feels a little more comfortable with letting her go out and take an interview. I think the trick for them, though, is not to get too overconfident based on one debate, because she's still got an awful lot of baggage she's got to account for. And as we said, if they thought they had closed the deal with this debate, they wouldn't ask for another one. And again, this is a bit of inside baseball, but they must have data. The campaign must have data showing, yeah, she did well, but she hasn't moved the needle, because understandably, one debate for a candidate who's largely been panned across the board and who was elevated without getting a single vote, understandably, people are saying, I need to know more about this person. I need to know what she really believes. And I think as effective as her performance was in this first debate, I don't think she has quite answered the questions for Americans who don't know her, at least not yet.
Well, let's delve into this idea about her answering questions. I think you're absolutely right. It will likely be her campaign going forward. She'll do rallies, whether large or small, to friendly audiences, because that's who you do your rallies for. And she'll crisscross the country, mostly the battleground states. And I think she will do interviews, but they'll be of the CNN type that she did with.
There'll be friendly interviews.
Yeah, because she hasn't, as far as I can tell, in this entire campaign season to date, she hasn't been pressed in any real manner. And I think it was one of the first questions in the actual debate. And it was first, the one of the moderators, they started talking about how you've changed your position on fracking. Now you wanted mandatory government buyback programs for assault weapons. I'm doing the air quotes there. Now your campaign says you don't. You supported decriminalizing border crosses. Now you're taking a harder line. And they said, I know that you say your values have not changed. So then why have so many of your positions changed? Now that is a great question. But how did she answer? She went on attacking Trump. She didn't answer the question about what
Right.
have changed.
Well, look, these candidates go into these debates with an agenda that they need to accomplish. They need to get across certain points. I mean, for example, Kamala Harris had to put in Charlottesville somewhere. So if she couldn't fit it into the framework of a question about Charlottesville or racism or whatever, if it wasn't in that context, she had to shoehorn it in, just like Trump did. He had to shoehorn in that this is the worst president in the history of the world, and that, he engaged in plenty of exaggerations himself. So I think people take those kind of sweeping global statements with a grain of salt. They're looking for which person can improve the lives that have gone downhill over the last 4 years.
I really want to dig into this Charlottesville thing, Tim, because just for anybody who hasn't come across this. So in Charlottesville, there was a big protest and a counter protest, and one guy killed very tragically a woman by running her over. And then Donald Trump took to the stage saying that he condemned the white supremacists, and he said there were very fine people on both sides of the protest, but made very, very clear that he was not talking about the white supremacists and neo-Nazis. Now,
it's incredible that we still have to prosecute this case 7 years later. What he was saying, and this is important for people to understand, what he was saying, there are very fine people on both sides, mean what it meant was the toppling of Confederate era statutes, that there were people that felt they should be pulled down and others who wanted to preserve them. And there were legitimate arguments on both sides. And that's what Trump was saying. But look, when you're with a media that's looking to exploit every opening to make a president look bad, which is what they've done with Donald Trump for about 10 years, then you're left with very few options.
See, the thing is, Tim, I think this is far more important than just a throwaway line, because everybody who watches the video, beyond the, by the way, that has been doing a very selectively edited clip on social media in the wake of the debate of him saying very fine people on both sides.
Also with the one where he said, now suddenly she's black, as if that was, he was repulsed by the fact that she's black, right? Rather than the fact that she had presented herself as South Asian for several years. Now, all of a sudden, for the purposes of this campaign, she's black. But, that's what politicians do. I don't think that's something that's going to be particularly significant to the voters.
I really want to make my point on this, Tim, is that it's being debunked by even Snopes, which has no love for Donald Trump, and it's regarded as the main fact checker, I guess, in America. It's been debunked. And so Kamala Harris, there's no way that she does not know that that is a lie, that he said that there's fine people referring to neo-Nazis. So she knows it. The people who were moderating the debate know it. And all of the media outlets that have refused to pick her up on peddling what is an outright libelous lie.
Well, it's a lie. You know what? It's a lie of enormous magnitude, one that actually may have had the most severe consequences of the entire Trump presidency, because Joe Biden claimed that the only reason he ran for president was after he heard what happened in Charlottesville. And again, how many times? You've lost track of how many times Joe Biden used very fine people on both sides. He said that statement, which is completely false, was the basis for him running for president. That's how much the corruption of that statement and of that presidency had on the 2020 race and really going forward.
Now, we're actually going to continue talking about media engagement and how this particular contest, this November contest, is going to go forward after this short break. Listeners, don't go anywhere. We'll be right back with you.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back on Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. We're very fortunate to have back with us Liberty Nation's senior political analyst and longtime host of this here radio show, Tim Donner. Earlier in the show, we've been talking the basic debate performance, how various questions were pushed back against and how others weren't when they perhaps should have been. But now, Tim, I want to talk about how we have touched on this briefly, but media engagement going forward for the presidential election, because at time of recording, there's roughly 6 and a bit weeks to go. How do you think that's going to look for the candidates? How are they going to engage? How are they going to spend their time?
Well, I think the whole election, both campaigns agree, and political analysts agree, and it's an easy point to agree on, that the election comes down to 7 states. I think the idea that these outlying states like Minnesota or Virginia, which were in play when Biden was running, are probably not in play anymore, which means I don't think Trump or Harris is going to spend a lot of time outside of those 7 battleground states. But what they're going to do, I think, is do an awful lot of narrow casting, which means they'll hit particular audiences on social media, a particular podcast, a particular angle they can take with a captive audience or a single issue audience or an audience that's particularly concerned about foreign affairs or one that's particularly concerned about issues of energy, for example. And it looks like there will be another debate, but what kind of interviews Harris does, a lot of the pressure is off her now, Mark, because, she has proven that she's not ready for prime time, which most people, I think, thought she would not be. And why not? Because she face planted in 2020, first with her own campaign. And then she was pretty widely mocked as the VP. So I think a lot of people were shocked that she's actually a competent candidate, but now the stakes become much higher. So I expect Kamala Harris, unlike Trump and Vance, I expect Harris and Walz to engage in a number of interviews, but almost entirely with friendly media. There's not going to be a press conference. She's not going to say, bring in all of the media and let them fire questions at me. That's not going to happen. If it does, I'll give her an enormous amount of credit. But I think she's going to continue doing what she's done, rallies, a lot of social media presence, and perhaps a second debate.
Let's talk about that social media presence. Obviously, each candidate has their surrogates within the media, especially social media, who are putting out talking points, who are putting out short clips, even making little movies, which are wildly entertaining at worst and might even contain some information at best. But what we've seen is actually, and I did an article on this on the pages of libertynation.com talking about the Trump campaign and how it really seems to me that he's redefining what it means to be a candidate dealing with the new media. And this is something that he almost kickstarted back in 2016 with his engagement on then Twitter. But now he's going around, he's doing podcasts, he's doing long form ranging conversations, like he did the almost 2 hours with Elon Musk on a Twitter, on an X live space. He did computer scientist and podcaster Lex Fridman.
It's an opposite strategy
Yeah.
to the Harris campaign. Trump believes the way to win is to go out there and to take every interview, hostile or friendly, to go long form, go short form, go soundbite, go in-depth interview. And it's really interesting because the Harris campaign has the opposite strategy to tightly contain her and limit her to places where they're confident that she can handle the questioning, because most of the media is wanting her to win. Let's be honest, they do. So that's so it's an opposite playing field for Donald Trump. It's sort of like if you look at a football field and it's flat all the way around, but with the media putting its foot on its finger on the scales, so to speak. It's like the playing field is not level, but just tilted a little bit one way so that Donald Trump can still win, but he has to win uphill.
Yeah.
And she could still win. All she has to do is win
running downhill.
And I think those are the essential strategies. And so the country's going to maybe get too much of Trump and not enough of Harris. So what are they going to make of that? It's just, I think we forget too that it's very hard to get into the heads of the everyday American who's looking at this race. It's so insane. I mean, you've had an assassination attempt that narrowly missed of one candidate. The other one had a disastrous debate, the worst of all time. Then he pulls out of the race. Then they elevate this woman who never got a vote, but was the vice president. And now suddenly she's the candidate. I mean, I think this is an awful lot for voters to process. And I don't think they have completed that processing yet.
Yes, we can actually draw a lesson from history here, and I'm sure you'll appreciate this one, Tim, with Harry Truman running against Dewey. And Truman got on the train, and this is where the term the whistle stop campaign came from. And it was William Howard Taft's eldest son who said, Truman doing this crisscrossing of the country on the train, that he was blackguarding Congress by doing this whistle stop tour. And he was the first guy who came up with that term. And yet we did see that, I believe it was the Boston Times or the Boston Herald that was so confident that Dewey would win that they printed.
It was the Chicago Tribune, of Dewey beats Truman. And the big picture is with Truman holding up that headline with a huge grin on his face.
And my reason for mentioning this, Tim, is that
one quick anecdote about that, Mark, which is that about 2 weeks before that 1948 election, a lot of the media even stopped covering because when they did a survey of the 50 political reporters covering the White House, all 50 opined that Dewey would win. Yes. So they even stopped covering. And in the end, Truman won fairly handily. So, that's another race there where what did people make of Harry Truman? Because suddenly he came in like 3 months into FDR's fourth term, and they weren't sure what to make of him. Well, he established who he was on that whistle stop tour, and he became Give 'em Hell Harry, and he appealed to the average American. I think Trump would do well to do something like that.
There's a certain connection there, isn't there, across 70 years of time and space. The reason I bring it up is that specifically is because of how Trump's running his campaign. He's doing the digital equivalent of a whistle stop tour. And my guess is that is about to become the standard operating procedure for every presidential candidate going forward. Now, we're going to be back with Tim Donner in just a short moment. Don't go anywhere.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back on Liberty Nation Radio. I'm your host, Mark Angelides, and we're back with Liberty Nation senior political analyst and longtime host of this here show, Tim Donner. Now, I think we've run the gamut on pretty much everything to do with the debate. So what I'd like to delve into now, Tim, is polling. Now, prior to the debate, it seemed that, obviously we haven't had, at the time of recording, we haven't had any polls post-debate yet. But it seemed that the gap that Kamala Harris had edged was closing very rapidly, and in some places, especially the New York Times Siena polling, had Trump in the lead. How do you think these trends are going to move as we move away from the aftermath of the debate?
I'm not sure that national polls are of any real significance at this point. I mean, after all, in 2016, Trump lost the popular vote and won the election. In 2020, Trump lost the popular vote by quite a bit more and still almost won the election. So I think it's nice to get a general sense of if a campaign is heading up or down in national polling, but it really matters in these 7 battleground states. And what Harris has done basically is to take the negative numbers that Joe Biden had because of his age and cognitive condition and wiped out those voters who said, I can't vote for him because he's addled. He's not all there. They don't have that complaint about Harris. So most people have gone back to their corners and then 2, 3, 4 point lead that Donald Trump had, I think we're now seeing that that was largely because of Joe Biden. And so with Kamala Harris there, I think this race is so close that neither candidate can rightly claim that they're leading. I think Trump has a structural advantage, the same structural advantage he had before. I think someone like Nate Silver has narrowed it down to the Electoral College and gives Trump about a 60% chance of winning. But that's with 2 months to go, and Kamala Harris still has to complete the palette of who she is. She has to continue painting the picture of who Kamala Harris is and what she needs to do to win this race as an underdog. She is the underdog, but she's not trailing by much, if at all. So I think we've got a 2-month sprint here, less than 2 month sprint to election day. And it's absolutely impossible to know where Kamala Harris is going to go from here because she's brand new, essentially. Whereas I think Trump's numbers stay largely the same because he is such a known quantity. I mean, he rarely lets a thought go unexpressed, as we know. And and so I think that we're headed to the land of the unknown, unlike almost anything we've seen, perhaps since Bush versus Gore, which of course was decided by about 560 votes in one state, Florida. As of now, that's what it looks like. But there's still a lot of there's a surprising amount of openness in the electorate that we didn't really have the last 2 years. We have 5%, up to 5% who are undecided, which could be 7 million people, as many as 7 million people. So there's still fluidity to this race, probably more than there would have been with Joe Biden and more than there was in 2020.
You know, I think that's fascinating that you say about how Trump supports kind of staying steady. And it will be essentially...
He's at 46%. I think he can count on 46% as his base because he's at 46% approval. He essentially got about 46% the last 2 times, which means that just under half the country knows Trump and pretty much knows who he is, knows his assets and liabilities, and has decided to vote for him, at least as of now. Right. So what that tells us is that Kamala Harris essentially has to try and plot an upward course. She has to do, and to do that, I think there's maybe three things that she has to do. One, she has to separate herself from the Biden administration in which she serves. Number 2, as you say, she has to complete the color palette of what and who she is and who she'll be as a president. And number 3, she has to try and convince people that they're better off under the Democratic Party than they were under the Republican Party headed by Donald Trump. And I think that last element there might be the most difficult hill for her to climb. How does she go about doing that? How does she manage that when really all the data is really against her? Well, this is the sort of mirror image challenge that Al Gore faced in 2000, because Bill Clinton, when he left the White House in 2001, he was still at a very high approval level because the Republicans had largely overreached, and, with the impeachment over the Monica Lewinsky thing and the like. And so Al Gore was faced with, do I run with Clinton using that as, hey, we've had peace and prosperity for 8 years now, I'm going to carry it on? Or does he say, I'm going to be different. I'm going to break away from the mold that that Bill Clinton set. Well, he chose to break the mold and to go out on his own. And I think a lot of people questioned that decision. This time, Kamala Harris, a tougher road to hoe because, unlike Bill Clinton, Joe Biden was not popular. His policies were not popular. His approval was low, as hers has been. So it's a very, very tough dance to say we need more of the same, but we need less of the same. That's essentially what she's saying. And even the most skilled politician, a Barack Obama, Bill Clinton, a Ronald Reagan, would have trouble towing that line.
Yes, I think you're probably right there, Tim. So let's talk a bit about how these numbers add up. There's two very quick points I want to jump on. One, we've talked briefly about how there's a national polling thing, which I think an average of national polls puts Kamala Harris 1.5% ahead nationwide. And we have discussed this, but that really doesn't matter because for Donald Trump, because it's all the election will be decided in the battleground states. And correct me if I'm wrong, I think Ronald Reagan was the last Republican to win the popular vote. Does that sound about right?
No, George W. Bush won the popular vote in 2004. But if you look at 1992, 96, 2000, 2008, 12, 16, and 20, the Republicans lost the popular vote in every one of those elections. Now you see why Democrats want to get rid of the Electoral College. And if I was a Democrat, I probably would too, because they won two. The Democrats have lost two presidential elections in this century where they won the popular vote. So, of course, they want to get rid of the Electoral College. It makes sense, but they won't be able to get rid of it. So, at least not now.
Well, they've got to
but
play
when we talk
today.
As of today, but if they get the filibuster, if Harris is elected, they control the Senate and House and they get the filibuster, all the radical ideas that Joe Manchin was able to prevent within the Democratic Party after the 2020 election will be back in play.
Yeah, and Kirsten Sinema, of course, she was also part of that little.
And the Electoral College, pack the Supreme Court, make D.C. and Puerto Rico states. This kind of stuff will be back on the agenda if Kamala Harris is elected and has a friendly Congress.
Just one final question for you, Tim, just about 30 seconds if you can. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Has now gone from support me, don't support me in battleground states, don't support me in red states, and now he's declared support Donald Trump everywhere. How much of an effect do you think that will have on both polling and the election?
Well, I think it's a head spinner for people, let's say, older than 50 years old who recall the greatness of the Kennedy clan within the Democratic Party. They were the family that defined the party for the longest time. Now he is attacking the party, saying it's not his father and grandfather's Democratic Party. And I think that's a head turner for people. And that when it comes down to the end and people say, do we want 4 more years of what we've just had? They look at Bobby Kennedy and say, well, he doesn't really have a dog in this hunt. He does now with Trump, but he doesn't really have a dog in the hunt. What does he think of his Democratic Party? So it will have an impact. The extent of the impact, hard to tell.
Tim Donner, thanks ever so much for being with us today.
Lots of fun, Mark. Appreciate it.
And that's all we have time for on this special edition of Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio American Network. I've been your host, Mark Angelides. I'd like to thank our guest, Tim Donner, Liberty Nation senior political analyst and longtime host of this here radio show. Remember, Liberty Nation does not endorse candidates or campaigns or legislation, and this presentation is no endorsement. Thank you, the listeners at home, for tuning in each week to join us on the show. Thanks for being here.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.